The courtroom was a stark, sterile place. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as people shifted in their seats, the sound of papers rustling filling the otherwise quiet space. Judge Thomas Hayes sat at the elevated bench, his face a mask of neutrality, his sharp eyes scanning the room. He had seen it all, cases ranging from minor traffic violations to more serious criminal offenses, and handled them all with the same methodical precision. He prided himself on being impartial, his judgments based solely on the facts before him, without any influence from personal biases. It was an ordinary Tuesday morning, and the docket was full. Most of the cases were straightforward minor violations. One by one, the defendants stood before the judge, their voices shaking as they explained their circumstances. Some were granted leniency, others were fined. The process was routine, almost mechanical, until Karen Walker stepped up to the stand. Karen was not like the other defendants. Her presence in the room was different. Confident, composed, yet undeniably calm. Dressed in a sharp navy suit, her posture straight, she addressed Judge Hayes with respect, explaining that the infraction she had been charged with was a result of a misunderstanding. She had parked in a zone she thought was permissible, only to realize later it had been restricted for a special event. She had no previous violations, no record to suggest any pattern of disregard for the law. As she spoke, her voice was steady, clear, and well-reasoned. There was no sense of defiance, no attempt to evade responsibility. She simply presented the facts of her situation, making her case in a manner that many would find disarming. The courtroom was silent, every ear focused on her. Karen was the kind of person who commanded attention, not through force, but through her quiet strength and integrity. Judge Hayes listened closely, his expression unreadable. He had dealt with cases like this before, people who had made honest mistakes, yet the rules had to be followed, no exceptions. Despite the calm nature of her explanation, Hayes felt a certain disconnection between the person standing before him and the words she spoke. Without hesitation, he passed down the fine. $350. The sound of his gavel echoed through the room, and Karen's face didn't betray any emotion. She simply nodded, accepting the ruling, though her mind was already processing the deeper layers of the situation. The moment was fleeting, but in it, a sense of injustice began to take root. Was this truly the fair judgment she deserved? Was it simply another instance of someone in power making a quick decision without fully understanding the person in front of them? As Karen left the courtroom, her gaze never met the judge's, but something inside her stirred, something that told her this moment wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a much bigger story. Karen stepped out of the courthouse into the brisk afternoon air, the weight of the fine settling heavily in her chest. The street was busy with pedestrians, but her thoughts were far from the crowd. She adjusted her sunglasses, the reflective lenses hiding the flicker of emotion in her eyes. But inside, a storm was brewing. The fine wasn't the issue. It was the unfairness of it, the sheer quickness with which Judge Hayes had passed judgment. There had been no empathy in his voice, no consideration of her side of the story. She wasn't a repeat offender, just someone who made an honest mistake. Yet somehow, it felt as if her explanation had been dismissed without a second thought. Her mind began to race. Karen had seen this kind of thing before. People judged too quickly, their stories oversimplified or ignored. She had spent years as a federal outreach coordinator, working in various programs aimed at bridging gaps between underrepresented communities and the institutions that were supposed to serve them. But this time, it wasn't just a case she could file away or explain away in a report. This was personal. This was about a system that didn't seem to care about the human side of a situation. The irony was not lost on her. As a coordinator, she advocated for fairness in every decision, for every community, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant. Yet here she was, a woman working tirelessly to bring equality to others, suddenly on the receiving end of a decision that seemed to ignore the nuances of her life. The sting of the fine wasn't just about the money. It was the symbol it represented. She thought back to her countless meetings, where she had faced government officials, judges, and law enforcement, urging them to see people as more than just statistics or case numbers. Yet now, she felt as though she had been reduced to a faceless defendant, her identity and role in society overlooked. But Karen wasn't one to back down. She wasn't the type to let something fester without action. As she walked down the busy street, her thoughts became clearer. She would challenge this, but not in the way one might expect. She wasn't going to start a protest or make a scene. Instead, Karen had always been a woman of strategy. She knew how to influence change from within. And the courtroom, as rigid and unfeeling as it might seem, had one thing in common with the program she worked on. It was part of the system. And that system could be changed, even if it was one decision at a time. This small, seemingly insignificant moment could be the beginning of something much bigger. It wasn't just about challenging the decision. It was about challenging a mindset. A mindset that judged too quickly, that didn't see the person behind the infraction. Karen's resolve hardened. She had a mission now, and it was personal. Judge Hayes sat alone in his office, the afternoon sunlight spilling through the blinds and casting long shadows across his desk. He had wrapped up his cases for the day, but his mind was far from finished. As much as he tried to focus on the legal matters in front of him, the image of Karen Walker lingered in his thoughts, refusing to fade. He had imposed the fine without hesitation, thinking it was the right call. But now, as he sat in the stillness of his office, doubts began to surface. Was it the right call? He had seen hundreds of defendants come before him, many of whom had similar explanations, similar stories of confusion or honest mistakes. Yet they hadn't all received such harsh penalties. What had made Karen's case different? Was it her calm demeanor, her professionalism, or was it something else, something he couldn't quite put his finger on? Judge Hayes leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. He had always prided himself on being a fair and just judge. He saw himself as a servant of the law, above reproach, his decisions based solely on the facts before him. But something about the way Karen had spoken, so composed, so articulate, had unsettled him. She had presented her case with such clarity that, in hindsight, he wondered if he had been too quick to make a judgment. His mind kept drifting back to the moment when he'd delivered the fine. He remembered the way Karen had accepted it without argument, her face a study in calm determination. There had been no outburst, no defiance. She had simply nodded and walked out of the courtroom, leaving behind a sense of quiet dignity that for some reason had felt out of place in that moment. It had struck him as odd that she hadn't fought back, that she hadn't raised her voice in protest. Why hadn't she? And then there was the nagging feeling that perhaps he had missed something important. Karen wasn't just a defendant. She was someone who worked closely with the federal government, someone who advocated for fairness and transparency. He couldn't shake the feeling that he might have misjudged her, that he had treated her just like any other person who had slipped up, without recognizing the larger context of who she was and what she represented. His thoughts were interrupted by the ringing of his phone. It was a call from a colleague, asking about a case they were both working on. Judge Hayes briefly listened, but his mind wasn't really there. He excused himself from the conversation and ended the call. He couldn't concentrate. Not today. He stood up, walked over to the window, and looked out at the city below. A deep sense of unease settled in his chest. Maybe he wasn't as impartial as he had thought. Maybe, just maybe, there was more to every case than met the eye. A few weeks later, Judge Hayes attended a federal outreach conference in the city, an event designed to bring together key figures in law enforcement, government officials, and community leaders to discuss ways to improve relationships between public institutions and the communities they served. The conference was being held at an upscale hotel with elegant displays and a bustling crowd of well-dressed professionals. Hayes had been invited as a guest speaker on a panel about judicial reform, a subject he had a personal stake in given his long tenure on the bench. As he walked into the grand hall, the chatter of excited conversations surrounded him. He greeted a few colleagues, exchanged pleasantries, and prepared himself for the upcoming panel discussion. He had done his homework, memorizing his talking points about fairness, transparency, and the need for reform. But as the day wore on, something unexpected occurred. During a networking break, a familiar face appeared across the room. At first, Hayes didn't think much of it. He had briefly scanned the crowd when his eyes froze on one person. Karen Walker, the same woman he had found not long ago. There she was, standing across the room in a group of organizers, speaking animatedly with a few officials. He watched as she moved through the crowd with ease, smiling and engaging with everyone she met, a sense of purpose emanating from her every step. His heart skipped a beat. He couldn't believe it. Of all the people at this event, of all the times for their paths to cross again, it had to be now. He tried to shake off the feeling of discomfort that washed over him, but it was no use. The irony was staggering. He had fined her just weeks before for a minor infraction, and here she was, an influential figure in the very space he had entered to speak about reform and fairness. It was a moment of surreal clarity. Hayes excused himself from his colleagues and made his way toward Karen. His footsteps felt heavier than usual, as though he were walking towards something inevitable. As he approached, Karen noticed him and gave him a polite, measured smile. It was the same calm demeanor she had shown in the courtroom, but this time, it was tinged with an unmistakable awareness. "Judge Hayes," she said, her voice warm but neutral. "It's good to see you here." He froze for a moment, caught between the weight of their past encounter and the professionalism of the event. "Ms. Walker," he replied, his voice sounding far less composed than he had hoped. "I didn't expect to see you here. I'm the Federal Outreach Coordinator for this event," she explained. "I've been working with several organizations to bring people together. It's important to create these kinds of dialogues." Hayes nodded, trying to mask his growing discomfort. "It's good to see someone with your dedication involved. I didn't realize you were part of this." Karen's gaze softened, her calmness unshaken. "It's my work. We all have a role to play, don't we?" Hayes felt a knot in his stomach. Her words, spoken so matter-of-factly, made him feel like a stranger in his own world. The silence between them stretched for a few awkward seconds. Hayes shuffled on his feet, feeling the weight of their last interaction in the courtroom looming over them. He knew he had to address it. There was no way around it. It wasn't just a matter of coincidental timing anymore. Their encounter here, at this conference, made it clear that there was something larger at play. Karen, sensing his discomfort, shifted slightly and gave him a polite but pointed smile. "I suppose we should talk about that day in court." Hayes hesitated for a moment. His first instinct was to brush it off, to continue pretending that the incident was just another part of his job, another day at the office. But looking into her calm, knowing eyes, he realized it was anything but ordinary. "Yes," he said, finally breaking the silence. I didn't realize you were involved in something like this. When I found you, I had no idea who you were or what you did." His voice faltered slightly, the words heavier than he intended. "Now, seeing you here, it's a bit unsettling." Karen nodded, her expression soft but steady. "I understand. I know it must be strange for you to run into someone you've judged like that." She paused, then continued with surprising calmness. "But I think it's important to understand that just because someone is in a courtroom doesn't mean they fit a particular mold, or that their actions should be judged based solely on one small moment. You made a decision about me based on one mistake, but that mistake doesn't define who I am." Hayes shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't used to being confronted in such a direct, thoughtful manner. In his world, judgments were made based on the letter of the law, not personal context. He had always thought of himself as impartial, above any emotional entanglement with the people who came before him. But now, as Karen spoke, he felt the walls he had carefully constructed around himself begin to crack. "It wasn't just the mistake," he said, almost defensively. "I've always felt that the law should be equal for everyone, no matter their background or status. And I agree with you," Karen interjected, her tone firm yet measured. "But what I think is often overlooked is that equality doesn't always mean treating everyone the same. Sometimes it means understanding the full context, the person behind the case. You don't always get the full picture in a courtroom, Judge Hayes." Her words landed harder than he had anticipated. The truth in them was undeniable, and it unsettled him deeply. He had been so focused on the black and white of the law that he hadn't stopped to consider how his decisions affected people in real life. People like Karen, who worked tirelessly to improve the system he operated within. Karen gave him a moment to process, her expression softening. "I can hold it against you. But I do think you should take a closer look at the impact of your decisions. It's more than just numbers or fines. It's about real lives." Hayes swallowed hard, suddenly feeling the weight of his own privilege. She wasn't angry with him. She wasn't accusing him. She was challenging him, in the most respectful and thoughtful way possible. It left him speechless for a moment. "I'll think about that," he said quietly, unsure of what else to add. Karen gave him a small nod, her calm demeanor never faltering. "I hope you do." That night, after the conference had ended and the bustling hotel had quieted down, Judge Hayes found himself alone in his office, staring blankly at the stacks of paperwork that seemed to be growing by the minute. His thoughts, however, were not on the cases that demanded his attention. Instead, they kept drifting back to the conversation he had shared with Karen Walker earlier that day. He couldn't shake the weight of her words. They had landed with surprising force, challenging the very principles he had spent his entire career upholding. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that his initial judgment of her, swift, detached, and impersonal, had been not just a mistake, but a failure to see the full picture. Hayes leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples as if trying to massage the tension from his mind. His career had been built on the idea of fairness, of treating every case with the same level of attention and scrutiny. But what if he had been wrong? What if, in his pursuit of objectivity, he had missed the human element of the situation? Karen wasn't just another defendant. She was someone with a life, a role in the community, and a commitment to change. But in the courtroom, he had reduced her to a mere infraction, a name on a docket, a case number to be processed. A nagging feeling clawed at him. Was it possible that his decision had been influenced by unconscious bias? He had always prided himself on his impartiality, on being above any external influence, but Karen's composed demeanor and professional appearance had caught him off guard. Had he been swayed by her confidence, by her calmness, assuming that people who presented themselves in such a way didn't need leniency? Had he misjudged her based on her poise and her professionalism? Hayes stood up abruptly and paced around his office, his footsteps echoing against the cold tile floor. He had always prided himself on making decisions based on law and evidence, not personal feelings or assumptions. Yet now, the lines were blurring. He retrieved a folder from his desk, a file on the outreach programs that Karen was a part of. He had done some research on her earlier, curious about her role in the federal initiatives she had mentioned. As he flipped through the pages, he realized just how deep her involvement went. She wasn't just another advocate. She was a key player in shaping the conversations around justice and reform. The work she was doing was exactly the kind of work he had always believed in, but here he was, judging her for something as trivial as a parking violation. A wave of guilt washed over him. He wasn't sure what he was feeling: regret, embarrassment, or something else entirely. But he knew one thing. He needed to do better. He had to reconsider his approach to his role, to see the people before him as more than just cases to be handled, but as individuals with their own stories and contexts. The thought of seeing Karen again loomed in his mind. What would he say? How could he undo the damage he had done? For the first time in years, Hayes found himself questioning the very foundation of his decisions, and it left him feeling vulnerable. The days following the conference were filled with unease for Judge Hayes. His mind was consumed by the thought of Karen and the conversation they had shared. Despite his best efforts to return to his usual routine, The weight of his realization continued to linger. Every time he presided over a case, he found himself reflecting not just on the facts but on the people behind them, on their stories, their circumstances, and how his decisions affected their lives. It was a shift he hadn't anticipated, and it unsettled him. The next week, as he sat in his chambers reviewing his docket for the day, he found his thoughts returning to Karen once more. He knew that he needed to take responsibility for his actions, but he wasn't sure how to begin. How could he reach out to her? What could he possibly say that wouldn't come across as insincere or out of place? He wasn't one to apologize easily, not in the way most people did. His apologies, when they came, were often formal, clinical. But this wasn't a typical situation. He wasn't apologizing for a legal error or a procedural misstep. He was apologizing for a failure to see the humanity in the people who appeared before him. Determined to make things right, Hayes decided that the best course of action was to speak directly to Karen. He picked up his phone and, with a hesitant hand, dialed the number he had found for her outreach office. It rang for several moments before a friendly voice answered. Federal Outreach Coordinator's Office. How can I help you? Hayes hesitated for a brief moment, unsure how to begin. Hello, this is Judge Thomas Hayes. I was hoping to speak with Ms. Karen Walker. There was a pause on the other end before the voice responded. One moment, please. A few seconds later, Karen's voice came through the line, warm and steady. Judge Hayes, this is Karen. How can I help you today? Her tone was polite, but Hayes could hear the slight edge of professionalism in her voice. She likely didn't expect to hear from him. Ms. Walker, he began, taking a deep breath. I've been doing a lot of thinking since we last met at the conference, and I realize I made a mistake when I find you. I was too quick to judge you without considering the full context of who you are and what you do. I didn't see the person behind the case, and I'm deeply sorry for that. There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. Karen's voice, when it came, was softer than he expected. I appreciate your honesty, Judge Hayes. It means a lot that you took the time to reflect on that. Hayes felt a sense of relief wash over him, though the discomfort of the situation still lingered. I know an apology doesn't change anything, but I wanted you to know that I'm committed to being more thoughtful and aware in the future. I've been looking into your work, and I respect what you do. I just wanted to say that. Karen paused again, and this time, Hayes could hear the genuine warmth in her response. Thank you, Judge. I believe that real change starts with those who are in a position to make it, and you taking this step shows that you're committed to doing just that. It's not about the fine. It's about understanding each other and recognizing that we all have more to contribute than what's seen on the surface. Hayes smiled, feeling a sense of clarity he hadn't felt in weeks. For the first time in a long while, he realized that perhaps the law wasn't just about enforcing rules. It was about creating opportunities for understanding and growth. Thank you, Karen, he said, his voice steady. I'll do better. I promise. Over the next few months, Judge Hayes worked hard to honor the promise he had made to Karen. He continued to reflect on the lessons he had learned from their encounter, striving to be more mindful of the people behind the cases he presided over. He began to see his role not just as one of impartiality and judgment, but as an opportunity to help foster change in a system that for too long had treated people as numbers rather than individuals. He started attending more community outreach events, working closely with local organizations to understand the issues that affected the people who appeared in his courtroom. Hayes found himself connecting with people in ways he never had before, listening to their stories, and seeking ways to make his rulings more compassionate and nuanced. He recognized that justice was about more than following the law. It was about creating a system where every person, no matter their background, could feel seen and heard. As for Karen, their paths continued to cross. She never brought up the fine again, but Hayes could tell that the respect between them had grown. They would exchange occasional emails about initiatives and programs they were both involved in. And sometimes their conversations would go deeper, about the future of justice reform and the changes they both hoped to see in the system. Hayes admired Karen's unwavering dedication to her work, and she, in turn, appreciated his openness to learning and evolving. One day, several months after their initial conversation, Hayes found himself at another event, a community panel discussion on judicial reform. This time, Karen was a featured speaker, discussing the challenges she had faced in her role as the federal outreach coordinator and the importance of making the justice system more accessible to everyone. Hayes sat in the audience, listening intently to her words. When Karen finished speaking, she was greeted with applause. As the crowd dispersed, she made her way toward Hayes. They exchanged smiles, and this time, there was no discomfort, no awkwardness between them. Just mutual respect. "Judge," Karen said, offering him a handshake. "It's good to see you again." Hayes took her hand firmly. "It's good to see you too, Karen. You've been doing incredible work." "Thank you," she replied, her eyes lighting up with appreciation. "But you've been making a difference too. I've noticed it." The exchange was brief, but there was a sense of understanding between them that hadn't been there before. As they parted ways, Hayes felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew he still had a long way to go in his journey of growth, but he also knew that he was on the right path. The work he had done with Karen, the lessons he had learned, had opened his eyes to the deeper purpose of his role. In the end, it wasn't just about the fine. It was about the opportunity for redemption, for change, and for understanding that had been born from a moment of uncomfortable reflection. And in that, Hayes found the true meaning of justice.